Hello and welcome to the first episode of Let's Ruin My Algorithm. In this show, what I'm going to do is listen to a random genre on Spotify, chosen at random by a computer, listen to it for a day or so, and then give my impressions. That's it. Obviously, I'm going to not listen to any hateful music or anything like that. And obviously, I'm not an expert in this genre. That's kind of the point. I listen to a lot of music, but like all of us, I get stuck into some of my favorite genres, my favorite songs, my favorite bands. So I decided to start doing this in order to expand a little bit, expand the music I listen to. I want to approach every genre to try to find something interesting about it, something enjoyable about it. This show is not to listen to K-pop and just trash it for 10 minutes on the internet. Eventually, I will probably listen to K-pop, and I'm going to try to find something redeemable about it. I don't think I'm going to like it very much, but hey, let's see how we go. In this first episode, we're going to be talking about Ethiopian jazz. That was kind of a hard one to start on, I think. I don't know much about jazz. I listen to about that much jazz, and I would have liked to start with something that I was maybe a little bit more familiar with, but hey, that is the nature of this show. It was chosen at random by a computer, and I listened to it for a couple days, and here's what I think about it. Watch out, because I am going to probably mispronounce some names here. They're non-English names, and I'll do my best. Apologies if you are a big Ethiopian jazz fan, and I totally mispronounced the name of your favorite band. Sorry. But yeah, what is Ethiopian jazz? Obviously, it's jazz from Ethiopia, but it's not really anymore just from Ethiopia. It's expanded worldwide and has quite a following and quite a few bands throughout the world that have been inspired or use the sounds of Ethiopian jazz. But it also uses elements of traditional Ethiopian music. So Ethiopian music is built on a 5-tone scale, but it also uses obviously Western scales and things like that. So it's a bit of a meld between, African, particularly Ethiopian, obviously, music and Western jazz traditions. In the words of, I have some notes here, obviously, in the words of one Ethiopian jazz pioneer, Molutur Astaki, he said, "Most of our Ethiopian music is based on 5 notes. What I did was fuse the 5 notes with 12 tones. For many years I've been experimenting, and the more I do that, the more complex it gets." And I think that is really the sound in a nutshell. You hear a lot of Western elements, obviously, but there's a lot of African elements. Mostly Western instruments that you would find in jazz: horns, guitar, bass. Astaki, played the vibraphone, and so you'll hear a lot of vibraphone in there, especially his music. But since he was kind of the pioneer of it, a lot of people have continued to use vibraphone and other percussive instruments. Strangely, it also brings a lot of elements from Armenia, and that's because in the 50s there were a lot of refugees that came to Ethiopia from Armenia, and they actually have a relatively large Armenian population in Ethiopia. I didn't know that. So you're getting a few of those Armenian influences as well, some elements of Latin music too. I heard that in particular. A little bit more history on Ethiopian jazz. It kind of started coming around in the 1950s. Just rephrase that Armenian refugee thing. I think they actually came in the 1930s, early 1900s. And Ashtaki, as I mentioned, pioneer, he actually studied music in London, New York, and Boston. So he discovered a lot of Western music during his studies, and then brought it back to Ethiopia and fused it to create Ethiopian jazz. He brought his own culture to Western music, and then we get what we now have as Ethiopian jazz. Ashtaki, who I'm going to talk about quite a bit because he was the big guy who started playing this music in the 1950s and 60s. He was a multi-instrumentalist. particularly a percussionist, a lot of congas, but he played vibraphone a lot, as well as the piano and the organ, but primarily a percussionist. Before him was a man named Nurses Nalbandanian. He was an Armenian man, and once again brought some of those sounds from Eastern Europe and the Middle East to the Ethiopian music scene. Then, it was going well until about the 1970s. For about 20 years, there was an oppressive government, kind of a puppet government of the Soviet Union, who didn't want any non-patriotic music being played or produced in Ethiopia. And that meant that there weren't many musical imports coming into Ethiopia, nor were they exporting much of their music. Prominent musicians like Istaki managed to actually get out of Ethiopia. He was on the board for the International Jazz Association. So even when he was in Ethiopia, they couldn't really touch him. So that kind of kept the scene going a little bit, but it wasn't as strong as it could have been. But from there, with the fall of the Soviet Union in the early 90s, there was a bit of a resurgence in the Ethiopian music scene, and it got exported worldwide, which is why we're seeing a lot of Ethiopian jazz bands from the 90s even to today. But overall, it's a genre that's had plenty of time to grow. It's still growing. It's still being produced. And it's a really interesting scene. So, as I mentioned, I listen to hours of Ethiopian jazz. I'm not into jazz, so this was a bit of a difficult listening exercise for me. But I enjoyed it. Overall, I found it interesting. Lots of Latin vibes, and that is by design. As I mentioned, Istaki, he was educated in London, New York, and Boston, but listened to a lot of Latin music and put that into his music. I also heard a lot of ska, and I'm not talking about like 90s ska, I'm talking about traditional Jamaican ska. A lot of those rhythms, as well as I think the horns in some horn lines in some of the songs really had elements of early Jamaican ska, like the Scotalites and Desmond Decker and bands like that. I think that was probably less ska influence and more just general Afro-Caribbean influence on the music. But what I also found interesting is most jazz that I'm familiar with are kind of the classic bebop jazz artists like Miles Davis and Charlie Parker and all that, and a lot more improvisational jazz, whereas this was a little bit more orchestrated and written. They would find a rhythm and a riff, and they sit on that for the entire song, and maybe do some solos and things like that. But really, it was a much more structured song than a lot of the more traditional jazz that I have a little bit of experience with. But there were solos, horn solos, guitar solos, things like that. But I really personally got struck by the melody. Very great melodies, mostly kind of relaxing and laid back melodies, but there were some more upbeat songs, some heavier songs. And of course there were mixtures of, Western and traditional Ethiopian sounds and instruments, typical jazz instruments, drums, guitar, horns, but congas were in there, lots of hand drums. You could tell it was African. As I mentioned as well, vibraphone, quite a lot in there. And you don't get many genres with vibraphone, especially these days. Vibraphone or xylophone or any sort of percussion melodic instrument. You don't hear a lot of those. So that was kind of refreshing to hear a different genre that that used a different instrument. But yeah, with that as well, I've always had a perception of jazz being relatively clean tones, especially on the guitar. And they went away from this a little bit. There were some tracks that really did use overdriven or distorted guitar. They really love their reverb in Ethiopian jazz, at least from my perception. Very kind of reverby, delayed, and gives a mood quality to it. But really, it's had plenty of time. It's had, what, 70 years now to kind of grow and evolve, and they've created their own sound. And I think there's still, Ethiopian jazz musicians are still experimenting and continuing to change the genre and grow the genre. It's not just stuck in the 1950s. It's changing. I listened to quite a few tracks, stuff going all the way back to the 1950s, all the way up to tracks that were made in the last year or so. There were some standout tracks, of course, and this is where I'm probably going to mispronounce quite a few names. One standout track, Circles by Kilbram Burhane. Slower and moodier track. Interesting guitar work. I always listen to the guitar. You know, obviously I'm a guitarist. It's something that I listen for and enjoy listening to. The guitar solo was a standout. It's a slow, moody track. I'll put up a few seconds of it for you to hear. And it's a long song, 8 minutes. And towards the end, what I really enjoyed was, rather than just finishing the song, there was a nice, long, drawn-out vibe between the drum kit and the congas. Yeah, that just kind of, you sat on it. It was quite relaxing and a nice 8 minutes. You know, I think I listened to that song actually 2 or 3 times in the long run. I enjoyed it so much. Another one I enjoyed was Dua Kula by Eric Kilo, Mamani Kita, and Mike Ladd. This was a modern one, and what I liked here was they kind of fused a poetry rap bit with one vocalist, and another vocalist, I think it was Mamani Kita, was singing more traditional Ethiopian melodies and in her native language, whereas the rap and poetry was in English. It's so interesting fusion of, you know, 2 genres, and experimental, and nothing that I've ever really listened to like that before. I'm sure that happens a lot in jazz and other genres, but I've never really been drawn to that sort of, it's not rap and it's not poetry, but it's basically poetry over a nice, cool jazz feel. But yeah, I like that.
New Orleans. So you know this story. It's long triangle. It's been here before.
Like that. One of my favorites, Recording 68 by Colonel Jafar. They're a Belgian band. Who obviously play Ethiopian jazz. This one was almost a ska song, I think. Heavy, pretty heavy song, big horns, really lively. I found a lot of this music really, I guess, relaxing. This wasn't as relaxing. It was fun to listen to. It was a big upbeat song. As I said, sounded like ska to me. If I didn't find that on an Ethiopian jazz mix and the band wasn't called Colonel Jafar, I would have thought it was a ska band. They're a band that I'd like to explore a little bit more, see if they're all kind of like that, or whether this was just one of their standout sort of big, lively songs. Another fun one that you might want to check out is Starlet Road Filling Station Romance by Elgati Oho Jonas and his Sounds of Joy. Another one, lots of ska, very ska-y. I listen to ska, I listen to traditional ska, and so I hear that over the jazz personally, but that's me coming from my experience of music. And if you're coming from more of a jazz background, listening to Ethiopian jazz for the first time, maybe you're going to hear something different. But that's kind of the joy and the fun of turning on a random music genre and drawing from your experiences, but also finding new ones. But yeah, the horns in Starlit Road Filling Station Romance, very early ska. I mentioned the Scatolites already, and that's really what I heard, similar to their horn lines. And maybe they were influenced by ska. I don't know. Another relatively new one made by a bunch of Englishmen in Leeds, Summoning the Monkey God by the Sorcerers. The bass line, it was all in the bass line. Really good groove, just something to sit on. They're not Ethiopian, obviously, but that just goes to show that this genre has grown throughout the world and has influenced people to make music in that vein. And finally, another one that I liked was Mogadishu by Compro Oro. Another one with a great drum groove, lots of vibraphone, and I guess the vibraphone is kind of the traditional Ethiopian jazz instrument because of Estaki starting it. You can tell they kind of took some initial ideas from Estaki and then grew them. And that's kind of how music evolves over time. All these songs that I've mentioned, I'll put some clips in, and I'll also link to Spotify or YouTube so that you can listen to and support these artists. I'm not here just to play you a whole 8-minute song. Listen to them, see if you like them. Leave a comment, tell me if you like them or you hate them, what you find, and what you're drawing from it, from your own experience. Somewhat ironically though, the songs by Malutu Istaki were not really my cup of tea. They were good, but not something that I enjoyed as much as some more of the modern songs. And I sometimes find that when I'm listening to older music that has inspired a lot more modern music. I personally listen to a lot of blues, and I like more modern blues than traditional blues from the 1930s. That stuff's great, but they were such pioneers and they were starting it, and they had some great ideas way back when, but it's taken 100 years of evolution to get where we are on some great blues music, and I think for the better. Personally, that's my opinion, and I think that's the same with early Ethiopian jazz. They had some great ideas, but they were still coming up with ideas. And then, I guess the later artists stood on those shoulders of giants, as you do, evolved the sound and made something better. That's not to say don't listen to Istaki. It's a great introduction to Ethiopian jazz, but it's not different enough to really say, oh, this is really out there. So overall, I liked it. I'd listen to it again. I did put some tracks from the playlists I listen to on. I've just got a big playlist that I just put on random. So it will come up back in my life again. I'm not really that into jazz in general, but Ethio-Jazz is interesting, and it's not hard. It's not hard to listen to. There are some genres, especially jazz genres, that are hard to listen to, and this is not one of them. Pretty accessible as jazz goes. Obviously, if you know more about jazz or African music, you'll probably get a little bit more out of this genre than I did. But that's the nature of this experiment, if you will. And the next time I'm listening to jazz, I'll probably get a little bit more out of it just because of my experience with Ethiopian jazz. What I also found is some of the music does stray quite far from what I would consider jazz. One was, this is a hard one, Bechayan Tegatu Tegodahu by by a man called Elemehu Eshete. It's a funk song. It was basically a funk song. And looking more into it, Eshete, who was making music in the 60s and 70s, they called him the Ethiopian James Brown. So if you want to know what sort of music he's making, Eshete, it's not jazz, it's funk. And, you know, I think he's got thrown more into the Ethiopian jazz thing because he was making music during the golden age of Ethiopian music in the 60s, in that Ethiopian jazz scene, even though he was more of a funk artist. And then also got thrown into some of the playlists were bands like the High Grades and the Psychedelic Aliens. The High Grades were out of Nigeria, and the Psychedelic Aliens were out of Ghana. And I think that's just Spotify being like, oh, they're African, let's just throw them into an Ethiopian jazz playlist. They were great though. It was instrumental funk. It sounded like the Meters, honestly. Obviously drawing influence from, you know, those like New Orleans funk bands, and just making it in Africa. Not Ethiopian jazz, but also interesting to discover a random band from Nigeria, and they rocked. And I think that also goes to say that, you know, East and West Africa have different musical traditions, but at the same time you can tell similarities between, you know, across African music genres, in the same way that, you know, you might hear different, you can identify that, you know, punk rock from New York is different from punk rock from London, and you can identify similarities between the two, but at the same time you can hear different sounds. But I think the playlist got something wrong there. I think that's Spotify not understanding African music and thinking, oh, all African music is the same. It's not. But I think, you know, it's interesting to listen to non-Western music, because I don't listen to a lot of non-Western music unless I'm doing something weird like this. And with that, it doesn't sound like world music. I've listened to some world music, and you know, when we've all got friends who are like, oh, I like world music, and they'll put on something and you can't really follow it. It's too different from what your ears are for me, mostly listening to Western music, popular Western music for that matter, and you're used to how Western music works. And it can be difficult to listen to music that works in a different way, different tonal patterns, different scales, different traditional rhythms that we're used to. But Ethiopian jazz doesn't feel like world music. It just feels like a new way of doing Western music. And I think in that way, it's opening the door well to non-Western popular music, at least for me, because I can't go from a guy who listens to basically only Western music and then to something that is completely non-Western. It doesn't sound, it's too difficult for me. Whereas if you kind of take a doorway through something that combines Western and African elements, then you can then step through and become more traditional, more familiar with elements that you're not used to, and be more comfortable listening to music that is built off scales and rhythms that you haven't grown up with. That's just the way our ears hear music, I think, personally. So check out Ethiopian Jazz. As I mentioned, I'll put some links to some of my favorite songs in the description here. If you like it, let me know. If you go beyond the 4 or 5 tracks that I've mentioned, let me know what they are. Let me know what you think. You know, this is not a place to sit and say, oh, I hate this. But, you know, you're allowed to say, oh, this is not my cup of tea, and here's why. Let's start a discussion, and let me know if you agree with me, disagree with me, or if you find some other tracks that sound great. Next week, I will be talking again. I have not selected the genre yet, so let's find out. Come back next week, and we'll see what we listen to. Thanks.